Sometimes I wonder if a child's heart can truly distinguish between an innocent dream and the prelude to a nightmare. That November night in 1962, as I ran barefoot through the pitch-black streets of Bakersfield with the metallic taste of fear in my mouth and my mother's blood still warm on my nightgown, I learned that yes, it can. The wind howled like a wounded animal through the oil derricks, and somewhere behind me, the sound of sirens began to wail. But whether they were coming to save us or too late to matter, I couldn't tell. Hello, my dears. This is Grandma Susie, 72 years old, speaking to you from my small kitchen in Bakersfield, California, where the winter winds still cut through these old bones, and sometimes memories hurt worse than the cold ever could. Anyone who sees me today, white hair pinned back, weathered hands, kneading dough for homemade biscuits, reading glasses hanging on that familiar colorful chain, would never imagine the darkness I crawled through as a little girl, or the terrible secret that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I tell you this story I've carried like a stone in my chest for 60 years, I want to thank you for being here with me. If my words touch your heart, please leave a like and tell me in the comments about the people who matter most in your life. Let me know where you're watching from. It helps me remember I'm not alone with these memories that have haunted my dreams and shaped every day since. But tonight, I need to tell you the truth. Not just about that terrible night when my father's hands became weapons. Not just about the brother I lost before I ever held him, something much deeper. Something I only discovered 40 years later. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about love, forgiveness, and the price of keeping secrets. I was born in 1953, when Bakersfield was still a working man's town, where the smell of crude oil mixed with the sweet scent of orange blossoms, where children played until the streetlights came on, and where everyone knew their neighbors' names and troubles. Our house sat on the edge of the Oildale district, a modest wooden structure painted powder blue with a front porch where my mother's geraniums bloomed defiant and bright, even in the deadest heat of summer. We were simple people, living simple lives. My father, Anthony, worked the early shift at Kern County Cannery, leaving before dawn and returning after sunset with the smell of canned peaches and pears embedded so deep in his clothes that it followed him like a shadow. My mother, Irene, was a seamstress, one of those women who could transform forgotten scraps of fabric into quilts that told stories, curtains that caught morning light just right, and dresses that made the poorest girl in class feel like royalty. I was their only child, and in my 9-year-old mind, that was my life's greatest tragedy. While other girls complained about brothers who pulled their braids or sisters who borrowed their toys without asking, I lay awake at night praying for someone to share my secrets with someone who would be mine forever. A little brother or sister who would make our family complete. Mama, when will God give me a baby brother? I asked almost daily, following her around the house like a persistent shadow. She would smile that particular smile of hers, half hopeful, half heartbroken, and say, "One day, little flower, when the time is right." Our routine was predictable and precious. Saturday mornings, Daddy would let me sit on his lap while he listened to Dodgers games on our old Zenith radio, explaining why Sandy Koufax was the greatest pitcher who ever lived, and promising that someday, when money wasn't so tight, he'd take me to see them play at Dodger Stadium. Sunday afternoons after church, we'd walk to Yockett's Park, where I'd feed breadcrumbs to the ducks while my parents sat on a bench, Mama's head on Daddy's shoulder, talking in low voices about things I was too young to understand. Those were the golden days when I believed fathers were heroes, who came home tired but smiling, when mothers hummed while they cooked, when the biggest worry in my world was whether Vera Morrison would let me play with her new Barbie doll after school. The first crack in my perfect world appeared in the spring of 1962, subtle as a spider's web, until the light hit it just right. Daddy started coming home earlier some days, his face drawn tight with worry he tried to hide behind forced smiles. Mama began counting coins at the kitchen table after she thought I'd gone to bed, her fingers moving across the money like she was reading Braille, trying to make 47 cents stretch into $1. "Is everything all right, Mama?" I asked one evening, finding her crying silently over her sewing machine. "Just tired, sweetheart," she whispered, wiping her eyes quickly. "Adult worries, nothing for you to fret about." But children have radar for adult anxiety, and I felt the change in our house like a coming storm, the way the air gets heavy and electric before the thunder starts to roll. The storm broke on a Tuesday in June, when Daddy came home at 3 in the afternoon, instead of his usual 7:30. I was in the backyard braiding dandelion stems into crowns for my cloth dolls when I heard the front gate creak. Through the kitchen window, I watched him sit at our small table and put his head in his hands, not like someone who was tired, but like someone who was broken. "They closed the plant," was all he said when Mama asked. "Kern County Cannery is finished. 47 years of operation, and it's over." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, marking seconds that felt like hours. Mama's hand went to her throat, a gesture I'd seen her make when she was truly frightened. "What does that mean for us, Anthony?" "It means we're ruined." His voice was flat drained of everything that had made him my daddy. No severance, no pension, no nothing. The owner took what was left and disappeared to Nevada. 300 families out of work just like that. I crept closer to the kitchen door, my heart beginning to race. I didn't understand the full meaning of ruined, but I knew it was something terrible, something that made grown-ups look like scared children. In the days that followed, our life began to unravel thread by thread. The fresh bread Mama baked every week was replaced by day-old loaves from the discount rack. The Sunday ice cream tradition disappeared. The new school dress she'd been making me for the fall sat unfinished on her sewing machine, the bright yellow fabric looking like a broken promise. Daddy left every morning in his good clothes, carrying a thin briefcase, searching for work that didn't exist. The oil fields were laying men off, the other canneries weren't hiring, and the railroad had a waiting list 6 months long. He'd return each evening smaller somehow, his shoulders curved inward, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. It was in September that everything began to accelerate toward catastrophe. Mama had been feeling sick in the mornings, barely able to keep down the weak coffee that was all we could afford. I assumed it was worry making her ill. I felt sick to my stomach most days too, watching our family dissolve like sugar in rain. Then one evening, as she stood at the kitchen sink washing our few dishes, she turned to me with something like wonder in her eyes. "Susie, honey, come here. I have something wonderful to tell you." My heart leaped. Had Daddy found work? Were we moving somewhere better? Had God finally answered some prayer? I didn't know she'd been praying. She knelt down and took my hands in hers, her palms warm and slightly damp. "You're going to have a baby brother or sister. I'm pregnant, sweetheart." The joy that exploded in my chest was so intense, it hurt. All those years of wishing, praying, dreaming, and now it was finally happening. I was going to be a big sister. I was going to have someone to love and protect and teach everything I knew about the world. When I gasped, already mentally preparing lists of names, planning how we'd share my bedroom, imagining all the games we'd play together. "Next spring," Mama said, laughing at my excitement, "you'll have to help me take care of the baby. Can you do that?" Yes, I promise I'll be the best big sister ever." But even as I danced around the kitchen, something cold touched the edge of my happiness. Daddy wasn't home yet, and I wondered, with the terrible intuition children sometimes have, how he would react to news that should have been the best thing in the world. I found out an hour later, when he walked through the door, his face already etched with the day's disappointments, and found me practically vibrating with excitement. "Nah, Daddy? Guess what? Mama's having a baby. I'm going to have a brother or sister." The silence that followed was like a physical blow. Daddy stopped dead in the doorway, his briefcase falling from his hand to hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and then something that looked terrifyingly like rage. "What did you say?" "I'm pregnant, Anthony," Mama said quietly from where she stood by the stove, her voice barely above a whisper. "About 6 weeks along." The transformation in my father was immediate and frightening. The man who had spent Saturday mornings teaching me about baseball, who had carried me on his shoulders at the county fair, who had read me bedtime stories in funny voices, that man disappeared, completely replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "Are you out of your mind?" He whispered, his voice so low it was almost a hiss. Right now, you decide to get pregnant?" "It wasn't decided, Anthony. It just happened." "Nothing just happens, Irene. We can barely feed the child we have. We're 3 months behind on rent. I haven't had steady work in 4 months. And you—" He gestured at her stomach as if it were something disgusting. "You do this to us now?" I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, watching this stranger who looked like my father destroy the happiness I'd felt just moments before. This was wrong. Babies were supposed to be blessings. Families were supposed to celebrate. Why was Daddy acting like Mama had done something terrible? "Susie, go to your room," Mama said, not taking her eyes off Daddy. "But Mama—" "Now, Susie." I retreated to my bedroom, but didn't close the door. Instead, I pressed myself against the wall and listened to my parents' voices rise and fall, like angry music catching fragments that made no sense to my 9-year-old mind. Can't afford another mouth to feed. What are we going to do now? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mama cry quietly in the room next to mine. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my own father, afraid of the stranger who had taken his place, afraid of what this meant for the baby I already loved more than anything in the world. The next few weeks passed in a haze of tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Daddy barely spoke to Mama, except to snap at her about money, about food, about anything that gave him an excuse to voice the anger that seemed to consume him from the inside out. When he looked at her growing belly, his face twisted with something between disgust and fury. I tried to maintain my excitement about the baby, drawing pictures of cribs and bottles in my school notebooks, saving scraps of fabric from Mama's sewing basket to make tiny clothes. But it was hard to stay happy when the two people I loved most in the world seemed to be slowly destroying each other. The breaking point came in October, on a day that started like so many others. Daddy left early to look for work that wouldn't exist, his face already set in the bitter lines that had become his constant expression. Mama and I ate a breakfast of oatmeal, stretched thin with extra water, not talking about the fact that it might be our last meal until the next welfare check arrived. But when 3 o'clock came and went without Daddy's return, something felt different. Usually he came home by 2:30, defeated but punctual. Today, the hours stretched on 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and still no sign of him. "Where is he, Mama?" I asked, watching her pace between the kitchen window and the front door like a caged animal. "I don't know, baby. Maybe he found some work. Maybe—" The front door burst open so violently it slammed against the wall, and Daddy stumbled in. But this wasn't the defeated man who had been leaving each morning. This was someone else entirely, someone whose eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, whose clothes smelled like the inside of Murphy's Tavern, whose hands shook as he tried to focus on our faces. "Anthony." Mama breathed, one hand going protectively to her belly. "You've been drinking." "Damn right I've been drinking." He slurred, swaying on his feet. "You know what I found out today, Irene? You know what Jimmy Martinez told me at the unemployment office?" He lurched closer, and I could smell the whiskey on him, sharp and acrid, nothing like the man who used to smell like Old Spice and hard work. "His wife had a baby last month. You know how much it cost them, how much the hospital, the doctor, the medicine cost? $300, Irene. $300 we don't have. $300 we'll never have." We'll find a way. How? He grabbed her shoulders, and I saw her wince. Tell me how, because I've been trying to figure it out for 4 months, and I've got nothing. Nothing. You're hurting me, Anthony. Or I'm hurting you. His laugh was ugly broken. Lady, you haven't seen hurt yet. You want to know what hurt is? Hurt is watching your family starve because you're too selfish to think about anyone but yourself. That's not fair. Fair. You want to talk about fair? His voice was rising now loud enough that I was sure the neighbors could hear. Fair would be thinking before you spread your legs. Fair would be considering that we already can't take care of what we have. Fair would be— Stop it! I screamed, running into the kitchen. Stop yelling at Mama. She didn't do anything wrong. For a moment, Daddy looked down at me as if he'd forgotten I existed. His eyes were so strange, so empty, that I almost didn't recognize him. Go to your room, Susie, Mama said urgently. Right now. But Mama, I said go. I ran back to my room but left the door cracked. My heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. Through the narrow opening, I could see into the kitchen where my parents stood facing each other, like gunfighters in one of those westerns Daddy used to love watching on Saturday nights. You're drunk, Mama said quietly. You're saying things you don't mean. Oh, I mean every word. He took a step closer and she backed up until she hit the kitchen counter. You know what I think, Irene? I think you got pregnant on purpose. I think you knew how bad things were getting, and you figured a baby would somehow fix everything. That's crazy. Is it because it seems awfully convenient you getting pregnant right when I lose my job? Like, maybe you thought I'd work harder, try harder if there was another mouth to feed. You're scaring me, Anthony. Good. Maybe you should be scared. Maybe if you were scared, you'd think before you make decisions that affect all of us. And then, as I watched through the crack in my door, my father did something I never could have imagined in my worst nightmares. He drew back his hand and slapped my mother across the face so hard, she stumbled backward into the kitchen cabinets. The sound was like a breaking branch, sharp and final. Mama's cry of pain and shock went through me like electricity. She slid down the cabinets to sit on the floor, one hand pressed to her reddening cheek, the other wrapped protectively around her belly. Anthony, she whispered, her voice broken. Please, think about the baby. The baby. Something inhuman flickered across his face. You know what I think about the baby, Irene? I think the baby is the worst thing that ever happened to this family. He pulled back his foot and kicked her. Not once, but 3 times in the stomach, where my brother or sister was growing innocent and helpless. Mama's scream was a sound I'd never heard before, animal and raw, the sound of something breaking that could never be fixed. She doubled over, gasping, and I saw something dark spreading across the front of her dress. Blood. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran. Out of my room, through the kitchen where my father stood swaying over my fallen mother, out the front door, and into the night. The November air cut through my thin nightgown like knives, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was getting help, finding someone who could save Mama and the baby, someone who could stop the monster that had taken over my daddy's body. I ran barefoot down Norris Road, past the sleeping houses with their warm yellow windows, past the all-night diner where truckers stopped for coffee, past the gas station with its buzzing neon sign. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, until I tasted blood in my mouth and tears blurred my vision completely. The police station sat on the corner of Truxton and Chester, a low brick building that had never looked so much like salvation. I burst through the front door like a wild thing, gasping and sobbing, my feet bleeding from the broken glass and sharp rocks I'd run across. 2 officers were inside, a young one behind the desk, and an older man with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples. When they saw me, a 9-year-old girl in a blood-stained nightgown, their faces went from boredom to high alert in an instant. My mama! I gasped the words coming out in broken pieces. My daddy hurt her. She's bleeding. The baby. The older officer, whose nameplate read SGT. Oliver was already reaching for his hat and keys. Where do you live, honey? I gave him the address, and he was moving before I finished speaking. George, call for an ambulance and have them meet us at... He paused and looked down at me. What's the address again, sweetheart? 412 Norris Road, I whispered. 412 Norris Road. And get on the radio to dispatch. We've got a domestic violence call, possible medical emergency. The ride back to our house was the longest few minutes of my life. Through the patrol car's window, I watched our street approach, seeing our little blue house with its cheerful geraniums that suddenly looked like a lie. The front door was still open, spilling light onto the small porch, and I could see a figure moving around inside. Is that your father? Sergeant Oliver asked, his hand moving to his gun. I think so. You stay in the car until I tell you it's safe, understand? I nodded, but as soon as he got out of the car, I couldn't help myself. I watched him approach the house, cautiously speaking into his radio, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. He disappeared inside for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When he emerged, he was shaking his head grimly and waving urgently at someone I couldn't see. The ambulance arrived silently, no sirens wailing, which somehow made everything feel more serious, more final. 2 men in white uniforms rushed inside with a stretcher, and when they came back out, they were carrying my mother. Even from a distance, I could see how pale she was, how still. Her nightgown was soaked with blood, and there was so much of it that I couldn't understand how she could still be alive. One of the paramedics was pressing something against her stomach, while the other prepared an IV line, their movements efficient and desperate. I couldn't stay in the car anymore. I ran toward the ambulance, but Sergeant Oliver caught me before I could reach it. Mama! I screamed, fighting against his gentle but firm grip. I want to go with Mama. I know, honey, but you can't ride in the ambulance. I'll take you to the hospital right behind them, I promise. Is she going to die? Is the baby going to die? The look that passed between the sergeant and one of the paramedics told me everything I needed to know, even if they wouldn't say the words out loud. The doctors are going to do everything they can, was all Sergeant Oliver would say. As the ambulance pulled away, taking my mother and my hopes with it, the sergeant gently guided me back toward his patrol car. But I stopped and looked back at our house, where warm light still spilled from the open front door. Where's my daddy? He's not here anymore, Susie. When I got here, your mother was alone. Where did he go? I don't know, but don't worry, we'll find him. Something in his voice made me look up at his face, and I saw an expression there that I'd never seen an adult wear when they talked about my father. It wasn't concern or worry. It was disgust, mixed with a cold determination that made me shiver. For the first time, it really hit me. My daddy wasn't just the man who had hurt Mama. He was a criminal now. Someone the police were hunting. Someone who might never come home again. And the strangest part was I wasn't sure if that made me sad or relieved. The ride to Mercy General Hospital passed in a blur of streetlights and radio chatter. Sergeant Oliver tried to make conversation, asking about school, about my friends, about anything except what we'd both just witnessed. But I couldn't focus on his words. All I could think about was the blood, so much blood, and the way Mama had curled around her belly trying to protect the baby, even as the world fell apart around us. At the hospital, everything moved too fast and too slow at the same time. Sergeant Oliver spoke to the nurses in low, urgent voices while I sat in a plastic chair that was too big for me, my bare feet not quite reaching the floor. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear, and every time someone in scrubs walked by, I held my breath, waiting for news that never came. Finally, after what felt like days, but was probably only hours, a doctor in blood-stained surgical scrubs came to find us. He was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but his face was drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like sadness. He knelt down in front of my chair so we were at eye level, and I knew before he said a word that the news was going to be terrible. "Susie, your mother is alive. The surgery went well, and she's going to recover. But I'm very sorry to tell you that we couldn't save the baby." The world seemed to tilt sideways. My little brother, because somehow I'd always known it would be a brother, was gone. The baby I'd dreamed about, planned for, loved, before I ever met him, was dead, before he'd even had a chance to take his first breath. "Did it hurt?" I whispered, the only question my 9-year-old mind could form. "No, sweetheart, he didn't feel anything. He just went to sleep." A boy, just like I'd imagined. My little brother, who had never learned to walk, never hear me read him stories, never grow up to be my best friend in the whole world. The next few hours passed in a haze of procedures and paperwork and adult conversations I was too young to fully understand. Sergeant Oliver made phone calls speaking in quiet official tones about domestic violence, aggravated assault, and voluntary manslaughter. Social workers appeared and disappeared, asking questions about relatives, about places I could stay, about whether I felt safe. Safe? The word felt foreign in my mouth. How could anywhere feel safe when the person who was supposed to protect me most in the world had become the thing I needed protection from? It was dawn before I was finally allowed to see Mama. She was in a small room at the end of a long hallway connected to machines that beeped steadily, her face so pale it was almost transparent. But her eyes were open, and when she saw me, she tried to smile. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd had to use during surgery. "Mama!" I wanted to run to her, to throw myself into her arms and cry until all the hurt went away. But she looked so fragile, so broken, that I was afraid I might hurt her even more. "It's okay," she said, reading my hesitation. "You can come closer." I approached the bed carefully and took her hand, the one that wasn't connected to an IV line. Her skin was cold, but her fingers squeezed mine with more strength than I'd expected. "I'm sorry about the baby," I whispered, tears finally coming. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect him. Oh, sweetheart." Her own tears started, then sliding silently down her cheeks. "This wasn't your fault. None of this was your fault. You were so brave running for help like that. You saved my life, Susie. You saved me." We cried together then, for the brother I'd never meet, for the father I'd lost, even though he was still alive somewhere, for the life we'd built that had crumbled so completely in one terrible night. But as I sat there holding my mother's hand, something else began to grow inside me, alongside the grief. It was small at first, just a tiny spark of something that felt almost like anger, but cleaner than that, stronger than that. It was determination. My daddy had taken everything from us: our home, our security, our baby, our trust in the world. But he hadn't taken us. Mama and I were still here, still breathing, still holding on to each other. And somehow, some way, we were going to survive this. We were going to build something new from the pieces he'd left behind. 3 days later, while Mama was still recovering in the hospital, Sergeant Oliver came to see me at the temporary foster home where I was staying. He sat down at the kitchen table across from me, his face serious, but not unkind. "We found your father, Susie." My heart jumped, though I wasn't sure if it was from fear or hope. "Where is he?" "He turned himself in this morning. He's in jail now, and he's going to stay there for a long time." "How long?" "The judge sentenced him to 15 years for what he did to your mother, and to—" He paused, struggling with the words. "For causing the baby's death. 15 years. I tried to imagine what I would be like at 24, whether I would even remember being 9, whether I would still hate him, or if time would make the hurt fade into something manageable. Did he say anything about why he did it, about being sorry?" Sergeant Oliver was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. "He said a lot of things, Susie. Some of them were about being sorry, about wishing he could take it back. But words are easy. It's actions that matter, and his actions—" He shook his head. Your father was a man who let his problems become bigger than his love for his family. That's not something you can fix with sorry." That night, alone in the unfamiliar bedroom of my temporary foster family, I made a promise to myself and to the little brother who would never get to hear it. I was going to make my life into something he would have been proud of. I was going to be strong enough for both of us. I was going to make sure that what happened to our family would never define who I became. But I was 9 years old, and I had no idea how much more I still had to learn about love loss, forgiveness, and the terrible weight of family secrets. The truth about my father, the real truth that would turn everything I thought I knew upside down, was still 40 years away, buried in a box of letters that would change my understanding of everything that came after that terrible November night. But that's a story for later, my dears. For now, let me tell you about the long, hard journey of becoming the woman I am today, and how my mother and I learned to build a life from the ashes of the one that had been destroyed. Because sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil. The weeks following the trial passed in a blur of social workers' court proceedings and the exhausting process of trying to build a life from nothing. Our house, the little blue house with the geranium garden, where I'd spent the first 9 years of my life, was sold to pay for Mama's medical bills and the court-ordered restitution. Everything we owned that could be converted to cash disappeared Daddy's tools. Mama's sewing machine, even my small collection of books and dolls. We were left with 2 suitcases, a bus ticket to Los Angeles, and the promise of a new start with Mama's cousin Eleanor, who lived in a cramped apartment in East LA and worked double shifts at a textile factory to make ends meet. I remember that bus ride like it was yesterday, sitting next to the window, watching the familiar landmarks of Bakersfield disappear behind us, Mama beside me with her face turned away so I wouldn't see her crying. The Central Valley stretched out endlessly, brown and flat and empty, matching the hollow feeling in my chest, where my dreams of having a little brother used to live. Are we ever going to come back?" I asked as the bus pulled onto Highway 99 South. "I don't think so, baby," Mama whispered. "There's nothing left for us here." Eleanor met us at the Greyhound station downtown, a tall, thin woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much hardship to be surprised by ours. She hugged Mama carefully, mindful of her still healing injuries, and looked down at me with a mixture of pity and determination. "Well," she said, hoisting one of our suitcases, "let's get you 2 home." Home turned out to be a 1-bedroom apartment above a corner market where the smell of cooking oil and overripe fruit drifted up through the floorboards and the sound of traffic never stopped, not even at 3 in the morning. Eleanor slept on a fold-out couch in the living room. Mama and I shared the bedroom, and we all pretended this was temporary, that we were just getting back on our feet, that things would get better soon. But soon turned into months, and months stretched toward a year, and slowly the 3 of us began to accept that this was our life now. Mama found work at a small alteration shop in Boyle Heights, where her skill with a needle and thread was valued, even if it wasn't well paid. I enrolled at Roosevelt Elementary, where I was just another poor kid in a sea of poor kids, invisible and unremarkable, and grateful for the anonymity. The nightmares came every few weeks at first, then every few days, then almost nightly. I would wake up screaming, seeing Daddy's face twisted with rage, hearing Mama's cry of pain, feeling the wetness of blood on my hands. Eleanor would appear in the doorway, her hair in curlers, her face creased with worry, and she'd sit on the edge of my bed until the shaking stopped. It's going to get easier," she promised me one particularly bad night after I'd woken up the whole building with my screaming. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but time has a way of making the sharp edges softer. "What if I forget him?" I whispered, meaning my baby brother. "What if I forget what it felt like to love him?" "You won't forget the love, Susie. Love doesn't work that way. The pain might fade, but the love stays forever." She was right about some things and wrong about others. The nightmares did eventually become less frequent, less vivid. The constant ache in my chest where my brother should have been did soften from a sharp pain to a dull throb. But I never forgot the love. If anything, it grew stronger over the years, becoming the foundation for every important decision I would make for the rest of my life. School became my refuge. Mrs. Rodriguez, my fifth-grade teacher, recognized something in me. Maybe it was the hunger for knowledge that comes from needing to understand how the world could be so beautiful and so terrible at the same time. She kept me after class to work on advanced reading assignments, entered my essays in school competitions, and talked to me about high school, about college, about possibilities that seemed as distant and impossible as the moon. "You have a gift with words, Susie," she told me one afternoon as I struggled through a particularly difficult passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. "Words can be weapons, but they can also be medicine. They can heal wounds that nothing else can touch." I thought about Atticus Finch trying to do the right thing in a world that seemed determined to punish goodness, and I wondered if words really could be that powerful. Could they bring back my baby brother? Could they make Daddy into the man he used to be? Could they erase the sound of Mama crying herself to sleep every night? But even as I doubted, I found myself writing. In notebooks on scraps of paper, in the margins of my textbooks, I wrote stories about families that stayed together, about fathers who protected instead of destroyed, about little brothers who grew up to be strong and kind and alive. I wrote myself into a world where love was more powerful than anger, where good always triumphed over evil, where children never had to run barefoot through the dark to save their mothers' lives. High school brought new challenges and new opportunities. I tested into the academically gifted program at Roosevelt High, where I was surrounded by kids who planned to go to college, who talked casually about careers in medicine and law and engineering. For the first time since that terrible night, I began to believe that maybe I could be more than just a survivor. Maybe I could be someone who mattered. It was during my sophomore year that I met someone who would change everything, Mr. David Chen, my English teacher, who had the rare gift of seeing potential in damaged kids and nurturing it without pity or condescension. "Miss Gutierrez," he said after class one day using the surname Mama had legally changed to after the divorce, "I've been reading your essays, and I think you should consider entering the county writing competition this year." "I don't know," I said, uncomfortable with the attention. "My writing isn't that good." "Your writing is raw," he agreed. "But raw isn't the same as bad. Raw just means you haven't learned to hide your truth behind pretty words yet. That's not a weakness, it's your greatest strength." He was right. I entered the competition with an essay called The Color of Silence, about the particular quality of quiet that fills a house after violence has emptied it of everything safe and familiar. I won first place in the county and third place at the state level, earning a small scholarship, and more importantly, the first real recognition I'd ever received for being something other than a victim. College had always seemed like an impossible dream, something for other people, people whose fathers hadn't destroyed their families, people who could afford the luxury of planning 4 years into the future. But Mr. Chen worked with me on applications, helped me navigate the bewildering world of financial aid, and convinced me that my story wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something that could open doors. "Universities don't just want students with perfect lives," he explained as we worked through my personal statement. "They want students who understand struggle, who've overcome challenges, who can bring a different perspective to the classroom. Your experiences haven't made you damaged goods, Susie. They've made you valuable." UCLA accepted me with a partial scholarship, and in the fall of 1971, I found myself walking across a campus that felt like another planet, sprawling and green and full of kids who seemed to glow with privilege and possibility. I was 18 years old, the first person in my family to attend college, carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases that were the same ones Mama and I had brought to Los Angeles 9 years earlier. But I wasn't the same frightened little girl who had made that journey. I was stronger now, harder in some ways, but also more compassionate, with a deep understanding of how quickly everything you think is permanent can disappear. I majored in English literature with a minor in education planning to become a teacher like the ones who had saved me, the ones who had seen something worth saving in a damaged kid from East LA. It was in my junior year in a seminar on modern American literature that I met Richard Morrison, a graduate student in history who was 4 years older than me and infinitely more sophisticated. He was tall and lean with dark hair that was always slightly disheveled, and brown eyes that seemed to see everything with equal parts humor and compassion. When he smiled, which he did often, the corners of his eyes crinkled in a way that made you want to tell him your deepest secrets. "You write like someone who's lived 3 lifetimes," he said after reading one of my short stories in the campus literary magazine. "Most people our age don't have that kind of emotional depth." "I'm not most people," I replied, and something in my tone must have warned him that there were stories there I wasn't ready to tell. But Richard was patient, and over the months that followed, as coffee dates turned into long walks around campus, and long walks turned into quiet evenings in his tiny graduate student apartment, I found myself opening up in ways I never had before. Not all at once the full story of that November night remained locked away, but piece by piece, I let him see the girl I'd been, the losses I'd endured, the determination that had brought me this far. "You don't have to carry all of that alone," he said one evening as we sat on his fire escape watching the sun set over Westwood. "Some burdens are lighter when they're shared." What if sharing them makes them real again?" I asked. "What if talking about it brings back all the pain I've worked so hard to get past?" "Pain that's buried isn't gone, Susie. It's just waiting underground ready to surface when you least expect it. Maybe it's time to let it come up into the light where you can deal with it properly." He was right, though it would take me years to fully understand what he meant. For now, it was enough to know that there was someone who accepted my broken pieces, who didn't need me to be whole, or healed, or perfect in order to love me. We were married in a small ceremony at the UCLA chapel in June 1974, just after my graduation. Mama wore a pale blue dress she'd made herself, and Eleanor came up from LA with tears in her eyes and a small bouquet of white roses. There were no family members on Richard's side. His parents had died in a car accident when he was in high school, leaving him as alone in the world as I sometimes felt. But his graduate school friends filled the church with warmth and laughter and hope for our future. As we exchanged vows, I thought about the little girl who had run barefoot through the streets of Bakersfield 12 years earlier, and I wondered if she could have imagined this moment, standing in a church full of people who loved us, promising to build a life with someone who knew my worst secrets and chose to stay anyway. "Do you take this woman to be your wife, to love and honor and protect in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Richard said, and his voice was steady and sure nothing like the uncertain whispers of doubt that had echoed through my childhood home. "Do you take this man to be your husband, to love and honor and cherish in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," I whispered, and felt something shift inside me, some frozen part of my heart finally beginning to thaw. We moved to a small apartment in Santa Monica, where Richard worked on his dissertation about labor movements in post-war America, while I taught English at a local high school. It was a good life, simple and quiet, and full of the kind of everyday happiness I'd almost forgotten was possible. We read books together in the evenings, took long walks on the beach on weekends, made plans for the future that felt solid and achievable. And yet, there was still something missing, some part of me that remained guarded, untouchable, even from the man who loved me most in the world. I carried my brother's memory like a secret treasure, and sometimes I caught myself wondering what he would have looked like, what kind of man he would have become, whether he would have understood the choices I'd made. It was Richard who finally gave me permission to grieve properly. "You know it's okay to talk about him, don't you?" he said one evening, finding me staring out the window with tears on my cheeks. "Your brother." It's okay to say his name, to wonder about him, to miss him. He didn't have a name, I whispered. Mama and I never chose one. He died before we could decide. Then choose one now. Give him the name he should have had, the name you would have called him if he'd lived. And so, on a quiet Tuesday evening in our little Santa Monica apartment, I finally gave my brother the name I'd been carrying in my heart for 13 years. Michael, after the archangel, the protector, the one who stands guard over those who cannot protect themselves. Hello, Michael, I whispered to the darkness outside our window. I'm sorry it took me so long to say your name out loud. I'm sorry you never got to meet the man I married or see the life Mama and I built after everything fell apart. But I want you to know that we made it. We survived. And every good thing that's happened to us since that night, every moment of happiness, every dream that's come true, it's all been in your honor. That was the beginning of my real healing, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Over the months that followed, I found myself able to talk about Michael more freely, to share memories of my pregnancy dreams, and the little brother I'd imagined but never met. Richard listened without judgment, asked gentle questions, and helped me understand that love doesn't die just because the person you love is gone. 2 years after our wedding, I gave birth to our son Daniel, who came into the world screaming with indignation and gripping my finger with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. As I held him for the first time, counting his tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of his miniature features, I felt a rush of emotions so intense they took my breath away. Joy, of course, and wonder at this miracle we'd created. But also grief, sharp and unexpected, for the brother who would never hold his nephew, never teach him to throw a baseball or tie his shoes or ride a bicycle. And underneath it all, a fierce, protective love that felt like armor wrapping around my heart. No one will ever hurt you, I whispered to Daniel as he slept in my arms. I promise you that. No one will ever make you feel unsafe or unloved or afraid. I won't let them. It was a promise I kept, though there were times when it wasn't easy. When Daniel had nightmares, I stayed up all night reading to him. When he struggled in school, I hired tutors we couldn't afford. When he wanted to quit piano lessons because the other boys teased him about it, I sat him down and told him that courage means doing what you love, even when other people don't understand. But what if they're right? He asked, his 8-year-old face scrunched with worry. What if I'm weird for liking music more than sports? Then you're the best kind of weird, I told him. The kind that makes the world more beautiful. 3 years later, Louise arrived as different from her brother as sunshine from moonlight. Where Daniel was thoughtful and gentle, Louise was bold and fearless, ready to take on the world before she could even walk properly. She was the child who climbed too high, spoke too loudly, asked too many questions, and loved too fiercely for anyone's comfort. She's going to be trouble, Richard said fondly, watching 18-month-old Louise attempt to teach the neighbor's cat to fetch. She's going to be magnificent, I corrected, and I was right. But even as I threw myself into motherhood with all the passion and protectiveness I'd stored up over the years, part of me remained frozen in that November night in 1962. I was a good mother, a loving wife, a dedicated teacher, but I was also a woman carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. I never told Richard the full truth about my father. I told him about the violence, about losing the baby, about the poverty and the fear, but I never told him about the man my father had been before that night, about the bedtime stories and the baseball games and the promise to take me to Dodger Stadium someday. I never told him that sometimes in quiet moments, I still missed the daddy who had existed before alcohol and desperation turned him into someone I didn't recognize. And I never told him about the letters. They started arriving about 5 years after our wedding, forwarded through Eleanor's address, since that was the only contact information the prison system had for our family. The first one was just 2 pages written in my father's careful handwriting, on prison stationery full of apologies and explanations that felt too little too late. I threw it away without reading past the first paragraph. The second one came 6 months later, and the third 6 months after that. Always the same careful handwriting, always forwarded through Eleanor, always ending up in my trash can unread. I didn't want his apologies. I didn't want his explanations. I didn't want any reminder that the man who had destroyed our family was still alive somewhere, still breathing, still thinking about us. But the letters kept coming year after year, and eventually curiosity got the better of me. It was 1982. Daniel was 6, and Louise was 3, and I was 30 years old, older than my father had been, when everything fell apart. Richard was at the university, the kids were napping, and I was alone in our house with a letter that had arrived that morning, heavier than the others, as if it contained more than just words on paper. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, and finally, after 20 years, opened one of my father's letters. What I read changed everything I thought I knew about that terrible night, about the man who had hurt us, about the weight of forgiveness and the complexity of human nature. But that revelation, my dears, and the choice I had to make about what to do with the truth, is a story that deserves its own telling. For now, let me just say that sometimes the most important letters are the ones we almost throw away, and sometimes the people we think we understand completely are the ones holding the biggest surprises. The letter in my hands was dated 3 months earlier, but it felt like it had been waiting my whole adult life to be read. As I unfolded the pages, 6 of them covered front and back in my father's still careful handwriting, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely make out the words. My dearest Susie, I know you don't read these letters. Eleanor told me as much when I wrote to ask if you were all right, if you were happy, if you had forgiven me enough to let me know that you were surviving in this world. She said you throw them away without opening them, and I don't blame you for that. I have no right to expect your attention, no right to ask for space in your thoughts when I used my hands to destroy everything you loved. But I'm writing anyway because I'm dying, and there are things you need to know before I'm gone. Things about that night, about what happened before you came running into the kitchen, about why I did what I did. Not excuses. There are no excuses for what I did to your mother, to your brother, to you. But explanations, maybe? Truth, even if it comes too late to matter. I stopped reading and took a shaky sip of cold coffee, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Dying. The word sat heavy in my chest, bringing with it a confusion of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Relief, grief. Anger that he was leaving before I'd decided whether I wanted to forgive him. You need to know that I loved you, Susie. Loved you more than my own life, more than anything else in this broken world. Every morning, when I left for work, I would stand in your doorway and watch you sleep, and I would promise myself that I would be the kind of father who deserved you. A father who would protect you from every bad thing, who would make sure you never knew what it felt like to be afraid or hungry or unsafe. When the cannery closed, when I couldn't find work, when the bills started piling up and your mother started looking at me like I was failing her, that's when the drinking started. Not much at first, just a beer or two to quiet the voice in my head that kept saying I was worthless, that I was letting my family down, that a real man would find a way to take care of what was his. But beer led to whiskey, and whiskey led to the kind of drinking that changes who you are inside. I wasn't drinking to feel good anymore. I was drinking to stop feeling anything at all. The letter went on for pages, detailing the spiral of unemployment, depression, and alcoholism that had consumed my father in the months leading up to that night. He wrote about the shame of having to sell our furniture, about the humiliation of standing in unemployment lines with men he'd worked beside for years, about the growing certainty that he was failing as a husband and father in ways that couldn't be fixed. But then, halfway through the 4th page, the letter took a turn that made my blood run cold. What you don't know, what I never told anyone, is what happened earlier that day. I had been drinking at Murphy's Tavern since noon, spending money we didn't have on whiskey we couldn't afford, when Jimmy Martinez came in with news that changed everything. He'd been at the hospital that morning with his wife Rosa, who was having complications with her pregnancy. While he was in the waiting room, he overheard two nurses talking about a patient who had been brought in a few days earlier, a pregnant woman who had been beaten by her husband, they said. A woman named Irene who had lost her baby. But Susie, your mother wasn't the patient they were talking about? There had been another case, another woman, another tragedy, just like ours happening at the same time in some other family across town? Jimmy got the stories mixed up, and when he told me what he'd heard, that Irene had been at the hospital, that she'd lost the baby, that someone had hurt her, I thought he was talking about something that had already happened. I thought someone else had attacked your mother. I thought someone else had killed my son. I had to stop reading. The letter slipped from my hands and fluttered to the kitchen floor as the implications of what I'd just read crashed over me like a wave. My father hadn't come home that night intending to hurt us. He'd come home thinking we'd already been hurt, thinking he'd failed to protect us from some other danger. The rage, the violence, the terrible things he'd said and done, they had come from a place of grief and misplaced fury, not from a desire to destroy his own family. It didn't excuse what he'd done. Nothing could excuse that. But it explained it in a way that made my heart break for the man he'd been before. That night, a man who loved us so much that the thought of losing us had driven him temporarily insane. With trembling hands, I picked up the letter and continued reading. I know how this sounds, Susie. I know it sounds like I'm trying to justify what I did, trying to make you feel sorry for the man who destroyed your childhood. But I'm not asking for your pity, and I'm not trying to escape responsibility for my actions. When I walked into that kitchen and saw your mother healthy and whole and safe, I should have been relieved. I should have held her and cried and thanked God that the terrible thing I thought had happened was just a misunderstanding. Instead, I was so drunk, so consumed by rage at a phantom attacker who didn't exist, that I became the very thing I thought I was protecting you from. I became the monster in your story, the villain in your mother's nightmares, the reason you can't sleep through the night even now, 20 years later. I have spent every day of the last 2 decades thinking about those few minutes in our kitchen, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently, any word or gesture or moment of clarity that could have changed everything. But there wasn't. The man who hurt your family that night wasn't the father who loved you. He was someone else entirely, someone created by alcohol and grief, and a misunderstanding that spiraled into tragedy. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Susie. I'm not asking you to visit me or write to me or even think about me once I'm gone. I'm just asking you to know that the father who read you bedtime stories and taught you about baseball and promised to take you to see the Dodgers someday, that man never stopped loving you. That man would have died before he hurt you. That man did die that night in a way. He died the moment he realized what he'd done, what he'd become, what he'd lost forever, because of 5 minutes of blind rage and drunken confusion. The letter continued for 2 more pages, but I couldn't read anymore. I sat at my kitchen table sobbing for the father I'd lost, for the brother who had died because of a terrible misunderstanding, for the 20 years of hatred I'd carried that maybe had been based on an incomplete understanding of the truth. When Richard came home that evening and found me red-eyed and shaken, I tried to explain what I'd learned, tried to make sense of information that changed everything and nothing at the same time. "Does it make a difference?" he asked gently, sitting beside me at the kitchen table where the letter still lay open. "Does knowing why it happened change how you feel about what he did?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I thought I knew the whole story. I thought I understood what kind of man he was, what kind of monster could do that to his own family. But if he was trying to protect us, if he thought we'd already been hurt, he still hurt you." Richard said quietly. Whatever his intentions, whatever confusion led to that night, he still chose to drink instead of dealing with his problems. He still chose violence over communication. He still killed your brother and traumatized you and your mother in ways that lasted decades. He was right, of course. The letter didn't change the facts of what had happened, didn't undo the damage that had been done. But it did change my understanding of the man who had done it, and that changed something fundamental about how I carried the weight of that night. For the first time in 20 years, I found myself wondering if forgiveness was possible. Not forgiveness that erased the past or pretended it didn't matter, but forgiveness that acknowledged the complexity of human nature, the tragic ways that love and fear and grief can twist into something unrecognizable. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was shorter, written in a shakier hand, and it contained something I never expected to see again. A photograph. It was small and faded, the kind of picture you'd find in an old wallet, and it showed me at about 7 years old, sitting on my father's lap in our backyard, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. I was wearing a blue dress with white flowers on it. I remembered that dress, remembered how it had been my favorite, because it made me feel grown up and pretty. My father's arms were wrapped around me, protective and loving, and his face was bright with the kind of joy that seemed impossible to fake. On the back in my father's handwriting were the words, "My beautiful daughter, summer 1960. The happiest day of my life." Susie, the letter began. I've carried this picture with me every day for the last 20 years, through every day in prison, through every night when I couldn't sleep for thinking about what I'd lost. I thought you should have it now as proof that what I told you in my last letter was true. The man who hurt you wasn't the man who loved you. They lived in the same body, but they weren't the same person. I'm writing this from the prison hospital, where the doctors tell me I have maybe weeks left, maybe days. The cancer is in my lungs, my liver everywhere it shouldn't be, and I'm not fighting it anymore. I'm tired, Susie. Tired of carrying this guilt, tired of missing you and your mother, and the life we should have had together. I don't expect you to mourn me when I'm gone. I don't expect you to remember me kindly or tell your children stories about their grandfather. But I hope, and this is selfish, I know I hope, that someday you'll be able to look at this picture and remember that there was love there once. Real love before everything went wrong. Take care of yourself, my daughter. Take care of your mother. Live the life I robbed you of, and live it fully without the weight of hatred holding you back. All my love, Daddy. The letter was dated 4 days earlier. By the time I received it, my father was probably already dead. I never found out for certain. I never called the prison, never checked the obituaries, never asked Eleanor to make inquiries. In some ways, it felt like he died for me that night in 1962, and this was just his ghost finally fading away. But I kept the photograph. I put it in a small frame and placed it on my dresser, where I could see it every morning when I woke up and every night before I went to sleep. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I'm still not sure I know what that word means in the context of what happened to our family. But it was acknowledgement of the complexity of love, the way it can exist alongside terrible damage, the way it can survive, even when the person who felt it has been destroyed by their own choices. The children never knew about the letters or the photograph. As far as Daniel and Louise were concerned, their grandfather had died when their mother was young, and that was the end of the story. It was simpler that way, cleaner, and they had enough challenges in their own lives without carrying the weight of our family's particular tragedy. But as they grew older, as they began to ask more sophisticated questions about our family history, I found myself sharing pieces of the story, not the violent details, not the specifics of that night, but the broader themes of how people can be destroyed by circumstances, how love and loss can coexist, how forgiveness is sometimes less about the person being forgiven and more about the person doing the forgiving. Why don't we ever visit Grandpa's grave? Louise asked when she was 12, old enough to notice that we honored my mother's parents' memory, but never spoke of my father. Because some people leave us in ways that make it hard to know how to remember them, I told her. Your grandfather loved me very much, but he also hurt our family in ways that can't be undone. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone stay in the past where they can't cause any more pain. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough for a 12-year-old to understand. Daniel, always more direct than his sister, asked the harder question when he was in high school. Did Grandpa Anthony hurt you, Mom? Is that why you never talk about him? I thought about lying about giving him some sanitized version of events that would protect him from the worst of it. But Daniel was almost the age I'd been when my world fell apart, and I realized that protecting him from difficult truths wouldn't serve him well in a world that was full of difficult truths. Yes, I said simply. He hurt me and Grandma Irene very badly when I was a little girl. He wasn't a bad man, he was a good man who made terrible choices when he was in pain. But the result was the same. Sometimes people we love can hurt us in ways that change everything, and we have to learn to love ourselves enough to stay safe. Is that why you worry about us so much? He asked. Because you know that people can change, can become dangerous? Partly, I admitted. But mostly I worry because I love you, and love makes us vulnerable. The trick is learning to love fully while still protecting what matters most. Those conversations with my children, difficult as they were, helped me understand something important about the weight I'd been carrying. The story of that November night wasn't just my story, it was part of their story too. Part of the foundation that had shaped who I became as a mother, as a wife, as a woman. By sharing it carefully, age-appropriately, honestly, I was giving them tools to understand not just our family history, but the complex ways that love and pain can intertwine in any life. And maybe in some small way, I was honoring Michael's memory too. The brother who never got to learn these lessons himself, who never got the chance to grow into the kind of man who could love deeply while staying safe, who could forgive without forgetting, who could carry the weight of family history without being crushed by it. By the time I reached my 50s, I had built a life that felt solid and meaningful in ways I never could have imagined as that terrified 9-year-old running through the dark streets of Bakersfield. Richard and I had been married for nearly 30 years, had raised 2 children who were making their own way in the world with confidence and compassion, had built careers that mattered and friendships that sustained us. Daniel had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a history professor at UC Berkeley, where he met and married Sarah, a brilliant archaeologist who shared his passion for understanding the past. Louise had gone in a completely different direction, studying physics at MIT and eventually landing a job with NASA, working on projects so advanced and classified that she couldn't tell us much about them except that they made her happy. Both of them gave us grandchildren. Daniel and Sarah had twin boys, Michael and Anthony, named with my permission for the brother and father they'd never met, while Louise and her husband James had a daughter named Irene after the grandmother who had taught them all about strength and resilience. Watching my children become parents themselves, seeing them struggle with the same fierce protectiveness and overwhelming love that had shaped my own choices, I finally understood something my mother had tried to tell me years earlier. We don't get over the hard things in life, but we can learn to carry them in ways that make us stronger rather than weaker. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to transform our pain into something that helps other people heal. It was Louise who gave me that chance in a conversation that took place on a rainy Saturday afternoon when she was visiting with 3-year-old Irene, who was napping upstairs, while we sat in my kitchen drinking tea and watching the rain streak down the windows. "Mom?" she said suddenly in the middle of a comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about something, and I want to ask you about it, but I don't want to upset you." "You can ask me anything, sweetheart. I know you went through something terrible when you were young. You've never told us the whole story, and I respect that some things are too private to share. But I've been wondering if maybe it would help other people to hear it. I looked at her, this brilliant woman, who had inherited my eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and wondered what had prompted this question. "What do you mean?" "There's so much pain in the world, Mom. So many families struggling with violence, with addiction, with poverty, with all the things that can tear people apart. And you survived something terrible and built something beautiful from the pieces. Maybe your story could help other people see that survival is possible, that healing is possible. You think I should write about it? I think you should consider it. You've always been good with words, and you have something important to say. Not just about what happened to you, but about what you made of it afterward." That conversation planted a seed that grew slowly over the months that followed. I found myself thinking about the letters I'd never sent to my father, the conversations I'd never had with my brother, the words I'd never spoken to the 9-year-old girl who had saved her mother's life by running barefoot through the dark. And gradually, I began to write. Not for publication at first, just for myself as a way of finally putting the whole story down on paper, of organizing the chaos of memory into something that made sense. I wrote about the blue house with the geranium garden, about the father who had been my hero before he became my nightmare, about the baby brother I'd loved before I ever met him. I wrote about the long journey from Bakersfield to Los Angeles, from poverty to stability, from fear to the kind of love that Richard and I had built together. I wrote about the letters that had changed my understanding of forgiveness, about the complexity of human nature, about the ways that terrible circumstances can transform good people into temporary monsters. And I wrote about hope, the stubborn, inexplicable hope that had kept me moving forward even when everything seemed lost. The hope that had convinced me to trust love again, to bring children into a world that could be both beautiful and dangerous, to believe that the future could be better than the past. When I finished, I had a manuscript of nearly 200 pages, a memoir that told the story of one family's destruction and reconstruction. One girl's journey from victim to survivor to someone who could help other people heal. Louise was right. The story needed to be shared. But it took me 2 more years to find the courage to let anyone else read it, and another year after that to send it to publishers, and another year to navigate the strange world of book contracts and editing, and the terrifying prospect of strangers reading the most private parts of my life. The book was published on a Tuesday in October, exactly 40 years after that November night that had changed everything. I was 59 years old, a grandmother, a retired teacher, a woman who had learned to carry her scars like badges of honor rather than sources of shame. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from readers who had survived their own traumas, who had lost children, who had struggled with addiction or poverty or family violence. Women wrote to tell me about husbands who had hurt them. Children wrote about parents who had failed them. Parents wrote about the terrible weight of trying to protect their children in a world that seemed designed to hurt them. But more than anything, people wrote to thank me for showing them that survival was possible. That it was possible to be broken and healing at the same time, that forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing, but about refusing to let past pain control your future choices. One letter from a young mother in Ohio, whose husband had been arrested for domestic violence, stayed with me for months. "Dear Mrs. Morrison, I read your book last week and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. My situation isn't exactly like yours, but close enough that I saw myself in your story. The fear, the confusion, the way love and terror can exist in the same house, sometimes in the same moment. My husband hurt me and my son last month and he's in jail now, and everyone keeps asking me what I'm going to do, whether I'm going to press charges, whether I'm going to take him back when he gets out. I didn't know how to answer those questions until I read about your mother, about the choice she made to leave and start over. I don't know if I'm as strong as she was, but your book made me realize that I don't have to figure everything out right now. I just have to take the next right step, and then the one after that, and trust that eventually I'll find my way to something better. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to be someone's daughter, and someone's victim and someone's survivor all at the same time. Thank you for proving that terrible things don't have to define us forever. With gratitude, Jennifer. Reading letters like Jennifer's, I finally understood what Louise had meant about the power of sharing difficult stories. My pain transformed into words, and shared with strangers, had become something that could help other people carry their own pain more lightly. It didn't erase what had happened to our family. It didn't bring Michael back or undo the damage that night in 1962 had caused. But it gave meaning to the suffering, turned it into something useful, something healing. And maybe in the end, that's the best any of us can hope for, not to escape the hard things in life, but to transform them into something that serves love instead of fear, hope instead of despair, connection instead of isolation. 5 years after the book was published, I got a phone call that brought everything full circle in a way I never could have expected. It was from a social worker in Bakersfield, a young woman named Maria Santos, who worked with families affected by domestic violence. She had read my book, she said, and wondered if I would consider coming back to speak to a group of survivors, women and children, who were living in a shelter, trying to rebuild their lives after escaping dangerous situations. I know it's a lot to ask, she said. And I know Bakersfield might hold difficult memories for you. But these women, these children, they need to hear from someone who's been where they are, someone who can show them that there's life after trauma. I said yes, without hesitation, though my hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. Bakersfield. I hadn't been back since that bus ride to Los Angeles when I was 9 years old, hadn't driven past the neighborhood where our blue house had stood, hadn't seen the streets where I'd run barefoot in search of help. Richard offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I needed to do alone, not because I didn't want his support, but because the scared little girl who had left this place needed to come back as the strong woman she'd become, needed to close that circle on her own terms. The shelter was in a part of town I didn't recognize, a modern building with security doors and bulletproof glass, and all the protections that hadn't existed when I was young. The women and children gathered in a large room with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, and as I looked around at their faces, tired, wary, hopeful, damaged, healing, I saw myself at 9 years old, at 18, at 30, at every age, when I'd had to choose between fear and faith. I told them my story, the whole story, including the parts I'd never shared publicly before. The letters from my father, the photograph that had changed my understanding of love and forgiveness. The long process of learning that healing isn't a destination, but a daily choice. When I finished, a woman in her 20s raised her hand. She had a black eye that was beginning to fade, and a 3-year-old daughter on her lap who played quietly with a battered doll. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you trust anyone again after someone you loved hurts you that badly?" I thought about Richard, about the years it had taken me to believe that his gentleness was real, about the way he'd waited patiently while I learned to accept love that didn't come with conditions or threats. "You don't trust everyone," I said. "You learn to trust wisely, carefully with people who earn it over time. But you don't let fear make all your decisions for you, because fear wants to keep you small and alone and safe. And sometimes the safest thing you can do is take a risk on love." Another woman, older, with graying hair and a cast on her wrist, asked, "What about forgiveness? Do you think we have to forgive them to heal?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for 40 years, and I still didn't have a simple answer. "I think forgiveness is complicated," I said slowly. "I think it's different for everyone, and there's no timeline for it, no right or wrong way to feel. What I learned is that carrying hatred hurts me more than it hurts the person I'm angry at. So I let go of the anger, not for my father's sake, but for mine." "But how?" the woman pressed. "How do you let go of something that big?" "A little bit at a time. Some days I forgave him, and some days I hated him, and some days I just tried not to think about him at all. Eventually, the forgiveness days started outnumbering the hatred days. But it took 40 years, and I still have moments when the anger comes back. A teenage girl, maybe 15, spoke up from the back of the room. Do you ever regret having kids, knowing what can happen to families? The question hit me like a physical blow, because it was the one I'd asked myself so many times during my pregnancies, during the sleepless nights when I'd watched my children breathing, during every moment of fear that parenthood had brought into my life. No, I said, and I was surprised by how certain I sounded. I don't regret having them. Bringing Daniel and Louise into the world was the best thing I ever did, even knowing how dangerous the world can be. Because the alternative, living without love to protect yourself from loss, that's not really living at all. After the formal presentation, individual women approached me with their own stories, their own questions, their own need to be heard by someone who understood. I stayed until the shelter's evening curfew, talking and listening and remembering what it felt like to be them, desperate for hope, afraid to trust it, needing to believe that survival was possible. As I drove back to my hotel that night, I took a detour through my old neighborhood. Most of it had changed beyond recognition. Apartment complexes where single-family houses used to stand, strip malls where there used to be empty lots, new streets with names I didn't recognize. But Norris Road was still there, still lined with modest homes and old trees, still the kind of street where children rode bicycles and neighbors knew each other's names. The blue house, where I'd spent the first 9 years of my life, was gone, replaced by a larger, more modern structure with a manicured lawn and security lights. I parked across the street and sat in my rental car, remembering the little girl who had lived there, who had dreamed of having a baby brother, who had believed that fathers were heroes and families were forever. That girl felt both infinitely distant and completely present, separated from me by decades and experience, but still alive somewhere inside my chest, still waiting to be acknowledged and honored and told that she had done her best with an impossible situation. And we made it. I whispered to her, to the darkness, to the ghost of Michael, who had never gotten to see how the story ended. We made it through, and we built something beautiful from the pieces. The next morning, before leaving Bakersfield, I stopped at the cemetery where my father was buried. It had taken me years to find out where he was. Eleanor had finally told me reluctantly after I explained about the letters and the need to find some kind of closure. His grave was simple, marked with a small headstone that bore only his name and the dates of his birth and death. No epitaph, no mention of the family he'd left behind, no indication of the complex legacy of love and damage he'd bequeathed to his survivors. I stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but thinking about the man he'd been, the man he could have been, the ways that circumstances and choices had conspired to destroy him. I thought about the photograph on my dresser, about the father who had loved me before he became the man who had hurt us, about the terrible fragility of human goodness. Finally, I knelt down and placed a small bouquet of geraniums on his grave flowers, like the ones my mother had grown in our front garden, flowers that had bloomed bright and defiant even in the harshest conditions. I forgive you, I said quietly, and was surprised to realize that I meant it. Not because what he'd done was forgivable, but because I was tired of carrying the weight of his choices, tired of letting his worst moment define my understanding of love and family and trust. I forgive you, and I release you, and I choose to remember the good man you were before everything went wrong. It wasn't absolution, I couldn't give him that, and he was beyond needing it anyway. But it was freedom for me from the anger that had lived in my chest like a stone for 50 years. Now, as I sit in my kitchen in Bakersfield, yes, I moved back here 5 years ago to the town where my story began. I'm 72 years old, a great-grandmother, a woman who has lived long enough to see the long arc of healing, the way pain can be transformed into purpose over the course of a lifetime. Richard passed away 3 years ago peacefully in his sleep, after 45 years of marriage that taught me everything I needed to know about the difference between love that heals and love that hurts. Daniel and Louise are both grandparents themselves, now raising children who carry my genes and my mother's strength and their grandfather's kindness without the burden of our family's particular tragedy. I started making these videos because Louise suggested it. She said the book had reached its audience, but that videos might reach different people who needed to hear the story in a different way. So here I am, talking to strangers through a camera, sharing the most private parts of my life, in hopes that someone somewhere might find hope in my survival. Because that's what I've learned, my dears, in 7 decades of living. We are all more resilient than we know, more capable of healing than we believe, more deserving of love than we feel. The terrible things that happen to us don't have to define us forever. They can break us, yes, but broken things can be mended, and sometimes the places where we're mended are stronger than we were before. If you're watching this and you're in pain, if someone you love has hurt you, if you're wondering whether it's possible to trust again, or love again, or hope again, I want you to know that it is. Not easily, not quickly, not without setbacks and struggles and moments when you want to give up. But it is possible. I am living proof that it's possible. And if a scared little girl running barefoot through the dark streets of Bakersfield can grow up to be a woman who chooses love over fear, hope over despair, forgiveness over hatred, then anyone can. The choice is always there, waiting for us to be brave enough to make it. Choose love. Choose hope. Choose the future over the past. Choose to believe that your story isn't over yet, that the best chapters might still be waiting to be written. And remember that somewhere in this world, there's an old woman who believes in you, who is rooting for you, who knows in her bones that you are stronger than whatever has tried to break you. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me share it with you. And thank you for having the courage to keep writing your own story one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. Until we meet again, this is Grandma Susie, reminding you that the light always returns even after the longest, darkest night.